Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we'll be continuing now with Chapter 7, Government Policy and International Trade, Part 2. So let's talk about the case for government intervention. There are two major arguments, the political and then the economic arguments. The first one being political, where we are protecting the interests of a certain groups with the nation, normally the producers, right? Often at the expense of other groups, normally the consumers. This is achieving some political objectives, such as protecting the environment or human rights, of course. Then the economic arguments talk about boosting the overall wealth of a nation to the benefit of both the producers and the consumers. So let's get first deeper diving into the political arguments. So we're protecting jobs and industries, protecting national security, maybe sometimes. This is for products such as semiconductors or steel that we might want to look at, right? Mexico and Canada are so involved in our production, and if we rely on them and we're not for steel, if we're not able to get those products, maybe we might be insecure at some point. And also for retaliation, using intervention as a bargaining tool and a force trading partners to play by the rules of the game. This can be definitely a risky strategy. Microsoft and China infringing copyright laws and the threat of trade sanctions is a really big part of what this looks like. Okay, let's go ahead and keep going. So when we talk about protecting consumers, we want to also mention that we're also banning unsafe products, right? So we're looking at Asia and how they banned beef for almost 2 years from the United States because there was a single case of mad cow disease. And so I guess they have a right to do that if they feel like they need to use these government interventions to protect the health of their people. Furthering foreign policy objectives. This is potentially granting preferential trade terms to a country it wants to build relationships with, or pressure or to punish rogue states. The example here that the book talks about, which I think is really a good one, talks about Iraq, and that in 1991, the U.S. resolution, the UN resolutions was saying that we did not want to, work on a fair basis with Iraq. So we were really talking about how we could intervene. Also about protecting human rights as well. And they show a photo here of the famous cigar maker, Jose Cairo El Cueto, rolling a cigar in Havana. And as you know, the United States bans the import of cigars from Cuba because we believe it's a human rights issue, that communism in Cuba is stalling the health and living situation of the people in Cuba. So, and also to mention, there are 2 more cases on that. Myanmar, we see with amber, we don't try not import amber from Myanmar because of the military regimes. And also in South Africa, for a long time when I was growing up, we wouldn't want to do any trade with South Africa because they were involved with apartheid, and they were not, and they discriminating against the blacks. So this has all now changed a little bit since the 1980s. We've had more government intervention. Let's talk a little bit about the economic arguments for intervention. This is actually started by Alexander Hamilton in 1792. If anybody has seen the Broadway show Hamilton, they mention all the different things that he did during his lifetime, and this is one of them, the infant industry argument. This is saying that an industry should be protected until it can develop and be viable to compete internationally. And again, that example of Brazil shows up with the auto industry, and that for 30 years, the auto industry was protected in Brazil. They was subsidized, etc., so that they could catch up to car manufacturers around the world. This argument has been criticized because of Brazil, actually, as in a good example that it's useless until it makes the industry more efficient. Once they lifted those those subsidies and things like that, they saw that Brazil, actually, the car industry could not survive on its own. Because it was always relying on those subsidies. And they say that if a country has the potential to develop a viable competitive position, its firms should be capable of raising enough necessary funds. And this is kind of how the world is changing now, as opposed to 30 years ago when Brazil got into this situation, that firms now have access to capital and to funds throughout the world. We're much more in the swing of borrowing money. And so if a company feels that it is in a competitive position, investors will come in to support that, as opposed to the government needing to come in and create subsidies, et cetera, or tariffs. So that was the assumption, that I couldn't access those funds initially. The next slide here has to do with Airbus. This talks about strategic trade policy. So by appropriate actions, governments can help raise national income if it can ensure firms that gain first mover advantage in an industry are domestic. And as we see that, right, with Boeing, that was heavily subsidized for a long time, and they did it. But it might be beneficial for government to intervene by helping domestic firms overcome barriers to entry created by foreign firms with first mover advantage. And this is where Airbus has come in. So there's been a lot of investment throughout Europe into Airbus from France and Germany, the UK, to make a competitor to Boeing. And they're doing really well at it. Airbus as well is creating a really nice product with these jumbo planes. So now we're looking at a revised case for free trade. What do the new trade theorists say? They believe that government intervention in international trade is justified, that's what they would initially say, but the classical trade theorists would disagree, as we spoke about last chapter, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The new trade theorists believe that while strategic trade theory is appealing in theory, it may not be workable in practice. They suggest now a revised case for free trade theory. So let's talk about that. What does that look like? Retaliation and trade wars. So what happens? That an economist, Paul Krugman here, he says that strategic trade policies to establish domestic firms in a dominant position in a global industry are beggar thy neighbor policies that boost national income at the expense of other countries. And so he's saying that, a country that attempts to use such policies will probably provoke retaliation. A trade war could leave both countries worse off. And we shouldn't engage in retaliation to help establish rules to minimize the use of trade distorting subsidies. And this is exactly what the WTO seeks to do. Domestic policies, governments can be influenced by special interest groups, obviously. A government's decision to intervene in a market may appease a certain group, but not necessarily support the interest of the country as a whole. And this is, again, where the farmers show up, right? The farmers have a lot of votes, and they've been really encouraging the politicians to continue to subsidize their industry, when there's statistics and research out there showing that if we were to just let the free market take over when it comes to agriculture, there'd be a whole lot more money in the world. A lot of people would be making a lot more business, and a lot of that money would be going to developing countries. So Krugman sees this as the further reason for not embracing strategic trade policy. And again, that shows up with what the author is saying in this textbook about how Donald Trump potentially is moving towards a more strategic trade policy. I'm going to stop here and continue with part 3 in just a moment.